I'm very happy to introduce this evening to you somebody who
Don't elaborate.
months ago, several years ago, I was just measuring it on my own time clock, taught here at Maryland prior to my arrival at Maryland, and was instrumental in actually introducing the University of Maryland to me. In fact, actually, we did a charrette one weekend, or several weekends, of a building that none of us actually show anybody anymore. It's a shingle-style clubhouse for a golf course in, I don't remember where.
Moosepack, New Jersey.
Moosepack, New Jersey. There, we remember that. In what is now the computer room on the second floor, the computer lab on the second floor, which used to be a kind of faculty project room, where faculty that might want to do a competition or have an upstart space for their office or whatnot would work for a while. And I worked on that along with Deborah and her, at that time, Kerry wasn't your partner yet, but he was about to become one of the first partners with Deborah in her firm, which began, well, it had numerous beginnings in numerous locations around the country, mostly places where she was teaching or places where she was exploring architecture. And then eventually, Deborah had an offer from Yale University, left the University of Maryland, went to teach at Yale, opened up her practice in New York, where the rest is history. Deborah Berke opened up a very small practice, dealt with small scale, very finely crafted, very stylistically, I would call sensible architecture that operated in New York and grew from a very small practice to what I understand today is over 50 people in the office in New York, which means it's a big practice now. And it's a practice that has had enormous impact. Deborah's work has been featured in nearly every major magazine. Her work has been accorded with major awards, both nationally and internationally. Too much to mention here, and really not necessary, because as you see the work, I think you'll understand its inherent quality, and it ought to be work that kind of transcends whatever your particular interests are, because there's a quality in a way that I think that I can describe Deborah that I've only heard applied to a few architects, that she's a real architect's architect. That if you're really interested in architecture, and you're an architect, then you're going to be interested in the work that Deborah Berke does. It's really extraordinarily fine work that comes out of a principle that Deborah helped to coin, the principle of the everyday, and a topic in which she wrote a book along with Stephen Harris back in 1997 called The Architecture of the Everyday, which I recommend you take a look at if you have a chance. Deborah went and did her undergraduate work, both her BFA and her Bachelor of Architecture at RISD. She got a Master of Urban Planning and Urban Design from the City University of New York. She has taught here at the University of Maryland, the Rhode Island Institute of Design, the University of Miami, and the Institute for Architecture, the legendary Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. I want you all to welcome Deborah Berke back home to the School of Architecture.
That was really nice, and it's very funny for me to be in this room when I was a lot younger. I taught Architecture 170 in this room. They still teach that class?
Yes,
oh,
sir.
Man, the earliest I've ever gotten up in the morning until I had a baby. I like making things. This is something we've made, and as Brian said, I am interested in the ordinary and in the everyday. What would happen to me is this became the ordinary. There are something like 470 million of these in the world today. I looked that up on Monday, so I'm sure it's at 480 now. And as somebody who loves everyday things, I thought the world was going to be like this, and somebody like me was going to be really happy. But the world actually looks like this, and somebody like me is kind of sad. Because what I'm interested in is everyday life, and from here on, all the pictures I'm going to show you will be of our work. sort of jobs of some contemplation, like this librarian, or jobs of creation. This is a graduate art student at Yale. So tonight I'm going to talk about my work in that context, the work of my firm, like those pictures you just saw. But first, just a little bit about us. We work in New York on 2 floors of a loft building. We're very neat. We work collaboratively. We make models as well as draw. We actually had a little model yard sale for some high school students. We work on paper. We work in every software imaginable. We also go bowling and play basketball. And we have art shows and parties. I think practicing architecture is actually difficult and it's hard work, and we try to make it as interesting as possible for people in the office. I also think it's not just about playing basketball and going bowling and having art shows, but it's actually to believe in something and then make what you believe in be manifest in your work. So as Brian said, for many years I was passionate about the everyday, and I built with a kind of everyday sensibility and almost like political agenda. You can see this is a space I designed, and it got written about critically, like, is there an everyday, or what does it mean if the architect's hand is actually completely invisible? Well, you pay for that? But the everyday that I was interested in, just like with the phones, was transforming into something I was really no longer interested in and found no inspiration in. And simultaneously, the world of architecture was becoming ever more star-driven and personality conscious. So in 2003, this is a photo spread from Vanity Fair, some of the stars of architecture. Oh, that red circle has shifted. It's meant to be around me. I'm sitting cross-legged at the top.
Looks like it's blocking out Zaha.
Well, no, Zaha, blocking Zaha's face, but you can't miss her because she's carrying the gold buttocks handbag.
Yes.
Right in the middle of the picture. Anyway, the projects I'm going to talk about, just to use that little stars to segue into showing you some work. This is Isabella Rossellini, a genuine star, breaking a bottle over one of my early-ish projects. So I'm going to start somewhat chronologically. This is at a project called Industria Superstudio, which is at a building in New York that started as a Rolls-Royce repair garage, and which we transformed into a compound of fashion photo studios. So this is its transformed condition, and to my mind, its success lies in the fact that you can barely tell the difference. The idea was this series of planes that existed within the building that got enhanced through our subtle architectural moves. And perhaps most interesting about the building was that it had a ramp because it had been a garage, and you could drive up to the 2nd floor. You actually, in our transformation of this building, could enter the ramp from the lobby, and you would walk up it to the main gathering space on the center floor. The studios were arranged around this gathering space in the middle, and in fact this staircase takes you up both to the bathrooms and to a kind of editing studio. The primary daylight studio, which looks like this with one of its walls folded, is actually about 6,000 square feet. It was the largest daylight studio in New York for a very long time. And in fact, the truss is original to the building, the window behind it is not. We pulled the metal off the truss to make a clear-story space. A lot of what we did in this project was to find great bones and reveal them. This is one of the smaller studios, same thing with the skylights. We created the bathrooms in a similar language to the building itself. Similarly, the doors that we added. And this is what they do in this place. I like old working buildings. Another old working building put to new use was this creation of this weaving, dyeing, and storage and sample facility for a rug maker. We actually made a former small munitions building that dated from World War II in Southwest Connecticut. It had, because it was a munitions building, the most spectacular sprinkler system you've ever seen, so we made that the centerpiece of the entrance. The plan of the original building was very simple. The volume on the left is warehouse. Who doesn't love a warehouse? Well, I love warehouses, I should say. They look like this, like nice and ordered and neat, and they cast a beautiful kind of creepy, otherworldly light. This one in particular opens directly up onto the work floor, which in this case is literally actually worked on. The rugs are woven by hand, and then the strips of rug are sewn together. So this is actually a well-sprung dancer's floor that we inserted into the building in order that there'd be some comfort for the sewing team. And we made access to the different unusual parts of the building very simple. All of the workspaces are clean and bright and straightforward. These folks actually dye their own fibers. They were way ahead of the natural fiber, natural dye trend. They were doing that first, and they have to do the dyeing in daylight so they can see what's going on. This is sort of their little dyeing lab, and I know you're thinking, what is this woman talking about? She hasn't showed us one design thing yet, but in fact, we really carefully located those exhaust hoods so they sit exactly in front of the windows. This is their sample room, also about work that's done in daylight. And this is the exterior of the building. Basically, the fenestration was created by us in what was a blank box full of munitions, and this, to my mind, flawlessly neutral color painted on the outside. We've also, over the years, done a lot of work for artists, transforming, again, former industrial spaces into studios and places to live. This was an ice house that had gone somewhat derelict. A new core was inserted into the middle, which allowed this particular owner to have a space to create the work, a space to show the work, and a space to live. Looks like this. This is the space to show the workspace, obviously, which it's sort of an inexpensive masterpiece of white paint, white Formica, good lighting, and concrete. When you enter and look, this is looking back toward the living area from the gallery space. The wall on the wall on this image screens all the way to the right, screens the living area. You can just see the rug. The rug is not in this picture, but working with a palette this limited, white paint, concrete, and white Formica, we had to pay attention to some really tiny little details. So this concrete seam, so we poured a new concrete floor with the Michelangelo of concrete floors, and then the center of that seam is the center line of the fireplace, because that was kind of the extent of the compositional tools at our disposal. These people really live a life of, no red wine, no ketchup, no mustard, just vinegar. And the owner is a very compulsive man. The paintings are those gradated grays you see in the background are actually painted by hand on a tiny little grid that's drawn with like an 8H pencil. And he weighs dry pigment, and if this one has 0.001 to 0.999, he paints a little square, and then he changes it by ½ a milligram, and he paints the next little square. So each painting takes about 6 or 8 months. Okay, so he's obsessed. So we actually admired his way of being and were as ordered as he was. So even though this tile, which we got at a surplus place, only cost about 2 cents a square foot, it was meticulously aligned with the drain coming out exactly at the center on the grid, because a guy who lives like this deserves that. And this is an unstylized snapshot from his closet. Another New York City project of a slightly, he's a real person and a really nice guy, actually. I should go back. It's all of these sort of I hate the expression adaptive reuse because it doesn't sound interesting. It sounds like a government issue expression, but we actually do a lot of work of reconceiving spaces that were originally made for one thing into something quite different, like Rolls-Royce repair garages or ice houses. But this space was the basement a double-height basement space that was conceived to be a triplex movie theater in the basement of an apartment house in Battery Park City. That's because I get the really good one. And our goal was to make it into a facility for the Battery Park City Parks Department. They have their own Parks Department, even though they're in New York City. And I have to say, you know, who doesn't like a project that has little green electric cars that you have to put in it? So the space, again, was double height because of what the theaters were going to do. And in fact, you can kind of see in this plan where they intended the theaters to be. You drive down the ramp, you can see where the little green cars are parked. And we hung from the structure of the building a floor at street level to make their program work. It is a working space on both levels, and the idea was to connect those levels in a lot of different ways, like glass in the floor. And it was also to be a real working space that could expand and receive flat files and fold out desks and accommodate seasonal changes in the number of workers and things like that. And we used double height spaces to make sure there was always a link between the people working downstairs and the people working upstairs. We used concrete blocks, solid wood, exposed ducts, a lot of steel, a very much an intentional background for this kind of inhabitation and effort. As you can see in the life of the building where some of these pictures were taken earlier and later. So that there was always a visual connection. This is in the conference room looking back into one of the double height working spaces and beyond to the window into the entry. Because for me, the fact that people would take my concrete block spaces and then hang ladders and pull up little scooters was part of what the beauty of making this was. Now, also in New York, but a little fancier, our client had purchased this, which was in the lowercase m meatpacking district, which is now the capital letter M meatpacking district. And we turned it into this. So you can see where the original window openings kind of led to this distinguished but anonymous organized facade. The guy who owns the building is named Pascal Danguin. He is the world's foremost electronic photo retoucher. There is not an ad campaign or a magazine cover that you have seen that he and his people have not manipulated. It was a three-story building, and what was interesting is that it only had windows at the front. So if you remember that first diagram I showed, we actually cut a hole down the middle of it. So when you enter, this is what you see, and the panel in the center immediately behind the desk is actually removable for when they produce very, very large hard copy images. Much of what they do everything electronically, but they actually print some of it. So this is what's immediately behind that wall, and way in the background you see that black slot. That's where like 60-inch printed images come rolling out, and they get spread onto this table to be examined closely. And you can see a little sleeve in the ceiling. On either side, remember the sleeve, on either side are both sort of photo kind of lab and digital labs. And on the next floor up is where the actual running of the business takes place. And you are now looking at the center of this big hole that's been cut through the building. And this is what it's like at the top floor of the building when you can look through the hole all the way down to that black table, which is one of the tables that you saw in the first image where photos can be pulled out. And it's interesting because what they do, he writes digital retouching software that you can't get your hands on. But in this very, very high-tech environment, they actually lean over the railing of this thing and just shout at each other, not so different from what happens here. And this is at the front of the building. Those big windows on the street are actually the spaces where the clients come and examine the photographs again in daylight. And there it is, this idea of anonymous yet also recognizable. You can see it's designed, you can see it's composed, but it's very much part of the street. It's fabric, not monument. I do occasionally get out in New York, and a number of years ago, not that many years ago, we were invited to Louisville, Kentucky, where we transformed 5 limestone-fronted 19th century warehouses into a small hotel. What you can see here, this is warehouse number 1, and then the others are 1, 2, 3, 4. And what's interesting about this is that they were party wall, very deep party wall buildings. They basically held bourbon, cotton, and tobacco back in the day. When Louisville went into its great decline, the street front looked like this, and our street front now looks like this. Louisville is actually a really beautiful town. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a great food, great partying, excellent bourbon. So the limited street frontage, and of course what you need in a hotel are windows, meant that we cut a hole through the middle of the building. And that, as shown in this section, essentially there are 2 stacked atria, one here, which has its floor on the bottom level, and then a second one here, which is inaccessible but allowed for rooms to have windows on the inside of the building. So this is a ground floor plan, and you can see the hole that we cut in the building, and you can also see, obviously, the party walls of the original structures. And this is a typical guest floor plan, and you can see how cutting that hole in the middle actually allowed for the creation of 10 more rooms on each floor. So the interesting thing about this hotel, in addition to that it's in these cool old buildings, is that it was created and envisioned and owned by a family that collects contemporary art. It's called the 21C Museum Hotel, 21C for 21st century. They only own work of living artists. And you will see work as we look through it, but it's not just hanging art as a theme, but actually this is their real collection. It is a real museum. But what you can see here looking through, we used the old doors that the traders would go in to turn that into the entrance to the hotel. And in the background of this image, you can see the large steel truss that holds up what remained of the party wall that we partially removed. So you go into the lobby, it looks like this. Because we cut the big hole in the building, we had a host of large hickory beams that hadn't been seen for more than 100 years, and so we milled them into wood, and we used that wood all over the hotel. That had a kind of nice, I don't like the word, I believe in sustainability, but I don't like the word or how it's marketed or anything else, but this had a nice sort of aura to it about keeping the wood that had been there for so long and putting it to new purpose. Those are Judy Fox sculptures in the background, and that's a film being projected on the ground. It's actually a film of people sleeping. It's 8 hours long, and they go through the whole night, and they sort of toss around in bed. It's tedious to watch if anyone's sitting.
A lot of popcorn.
Yeah. This is a view toward the long gallery space that is part of the lobby. And this is a view immediately after entering the desk, and you can see the sort of ghosted out woman is standing at the landing to the stair that brings you down into that lower atrium space, which is essentially an event space and a large museum gallery space. This is what it was like to put the truss in and hold up the remainder of the wall. They closed a bunch of streets and brought this thing in, and we brought it in the back of the building and then packed a lot of brick away. And you can see through the skylights in the atrium up to the second atrium above it. And there you can see that space again and how the art is displayed here. And this is the space above. You can see the man in the guest room. We did not take the entire party wall out. It would have been prohibitively expensive and structurally threatening to the buildings. So we reinforced it, cut the bottom away as you saw in that other image, and then cut these big holes in it so that it was lighter. And the holes, which we lit blue on one side and pink on the other, give you a kind of fabulously distorted, mysterious sensibility when you're in a guest room looking out at it. This is the entrance to the restaurant off of the main street. There's more of that wood. And this is the open kitchen part of the restaurant with some, how should we say, appetite-enhancing artwork. Yeah, particularly for vegetarians. Art is everywhere in the building. The penguins are by an Italian art group called the Cracking Art Group. They make sculptures of threatened species out of petrochemical byproducts. So these happen to be red penguins. They're all over the building, as you saw in that earlier image, and each guest room floor has a vitrine for showing art which changes, and a chandelier which is also a work of art different on each floor, kind of like the parking garage idea, the green floor, the blue floor, the red floor. This is the weird TV chandelier floor, so you don't forget where your room is. And this is a typical guest room in the hotel. One of the things we did was make the headboards out of this recycled milk bottle screen surface, so that there's art that you're allowed to take with you, which is tacked up to the wall. And there she is, looking pretty swell. Every now and then we do some retail work. If the product is interesting and the people are fun and intelligent. You're laughing about Berke snowboards. They actually are smart guys, but they close the office when it snows. They're based in Burlington, Vermont, and they did meet our criteria for being interesting and intelligent. We did 2 stores for them, one at their factory, which is a kind of pilgrimage site. I don't know if there are any snowboarders in the room. And one in New York City, down in Soho, which was conceived more as a place where suburban kids could bring their parents and their parents would spend money. The design criteria was to capture snowboarding without being hokey about it. This is the plan for the New York facility. It actually has a kind of curved projection wall, as you saw in those earlier sketches. The display of the boards themselves became walls within the space. The boards are really beautiful. And in those vitrines that are in the floor are boards used by, the stars of the snowboarding world, none of whom I met. And in fact, we used very simple display criteria. You can see standards and brackets for the shelves, and wood from Vermont for the walls. And this is an image of that projection screen, and what you see just beyond it, that white door is actually a door to a meat locker where you can try out the clothing. Out in Columbus, Indiana, which maybe in some class somebody told you about, it's a town with a lot of good tiny town with a lot of good architecture. We were actually asked to make a drive-through bank. I grew up in New York City. We didn't have drive-through banks. So we spent some time thinking about what a drive-through bank actually meant. And what we concluded that it needed to be was that the drive-through part was equal to not just a sort of pod-like addition to a bank building, but equal to the act of going in the banking hall as well. So, and then the other challenge about this site, we had to color the building red in this drawing, otherwise you couldn't find it, was a 6,000 square foot building next to a giant, you can see, big box building, and then the even bigger box building beyond it, which doesn't fit on the screen, and vast parking lots in all directions. So the question was, how do you make the building visible in this sea of parking lots? This is the plan of the ground floor. You can see it's unbelievably simple. It's 2 boxes at 90 degrees to each other, one that you drive under and one that you go into. This is it in section. So the thing you are driving under, as you can see in this section, actually becomes the skylight of the space where you do your banking. This bank, unfortunately, ceased to exist after 2008, but the building remains an icon on the landscape. This is what the banking hall actually looks like. Concrete floors. Most of the people who bank here actually work at a nearby engine factory. This is that skylight that's a very simple channel glass volume. This is it in use. Very exciting for me, the non-drive-through banking person, to actually have it being used. And one of the things that happened that we weren't expecting is that just outside this gentle glow of this building at night turns out to be like high school makeout central for Columbus, Indiana. Who knew? Who knew? Back in New York, we were asked to do an art gallery in the Chelsea neighborhood. This was a new building, new ground-up construction, and actually, so many of what we think about as art galleries are former garages and other old industrial buildings. That's a little hard to know what an art gallery actually looks like. It's essentially a store for expensive stuff with no windows. So we experimented with a lot of what should it look like tests before coming up with this. And remember this sort of cyclopsean window, it comes back. The site is next to the High Line. It was actually the first building built under the new High Line zoning code that impacted the whole neighborhood, so we were a real test case for the city of New York. The plan of the ground floor is very, very simple. You can see I basically make simple plans, and I like straight lines, but the owner wanted to make sure that when you walked in the door, you could look all the way back to here, to that wall there, and see what you were coming to see, and be pulled into the building towards it. And then beyond that was a very big gallery in the back, 60 feet long. So this is looking toward that work of art, and parallel to it is the office space where obviously regular visitors don't get to go. This is a space at the front, and if you remember that large window, the bottommost pane of the very large window is actually the natural light in what is a kind of intimate viewing room. This is in that middle space looking back toward the entry desk. You can see that my palette of concrete and white paint got a lot of mileage out of that. This is that same middle room and looking toward the back. And then an axial view connecting you to what becomes the great big space into which you can put almost anything. This is the outside of the building. The solid block beyond the white frame that's lower is in fact part of the building, and it is the part, and one of the many parts that responds to the High Line zoning. It had to be below the level of the High Line. And I guess I should say, the really big window at the tops of the cyclopsean window is actually the living room window of the owner of the gallery. She has a nice apartment up there which we designed, and also a roof terrace beyond that, complete with wildlife, an art farm. So we do in my practice actually a lot of houses. I'm only going to show you one tonight. It's north of New York City. It has a kind of interesting story. It was a solid concrete building designed by an engineer for himself in 1968. We gutted it, transformed it, did a big addition to it, renovated it, etc. So what you see is not really what he did, except you can see the concrete roof thing. That's the upside down U. He definitely did that, and they were damn hard to change. This is the entrance. This is in fact reworked, completely reworked floor plan. This is what you see upon entry. We introduced both wood millwork for storage. It had no storage, and planes of glass to help define areas. This separates living space from kitchen. This is that kitchen, which is part of the volume that we added to the building. This is looking from the kitchen through to the living room. The site slopes quite steeply, so the living room feels quite a bit like a treehouse. We totally reshaped the master bedroom area. This is part of a new bathroom, this perfect glass cube. This is the terrace on the outside, you get some sense of the height of the trees and the distance of the view. And this is the completely reconceived, reworking, and addition at the back of the building. On the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and this is currently under construction, we are doing an arts center. I don't know how many of you know New York well, but there's a whole, at the beginning of the last century, set of New York City public schools that all look like some version of this, built all over the city. One of the great architects of them was this guy named C.B.J. Snyder. This is a C.B.J. Snyder school. It was abandoned by the city of New York in the 1960s and taken over by guerrilla arts groups, including Mabu Minds, which is a theater group, Performance Space, which is another theater group, and Painting Space, which were artists taking over abandoned buildings and building studios in them in order to work. This is not an example of guerrilla activity, but it was the kind of stuff that was going on in this abandoned school. The city has subsequently reclaimed ownership and is working with those groups to make the building safe and habitable. So we were hired to make it larger, legally accessible, have a workable heating system, and rethought as a more collective community art space rather than competing niches within an abandoned, semi-abandoned building. In the construction process, which is what we're doing now, the building is quite derelict, but it does have some really kind of fetching details like that original stair rail and things like that. Our addition, which is marked in yellow here, and then the existing floor slabs are in red, adds community spaces, bathrooms, elevators, and as you can see here, access to the roof. It also allowed us to create a real entrance for things like theaters. So early on in the design process, we were studying what that entrance might actually be like. This is a plan of the ground floor. There was an empty lot next door to the building, so that's where our partial entrance sits, and you can see the doors on the diagonal visible from the street. And this is the top floor. The roof of the building needed to be completely replaced, so in replacing it, we have raised it to allow us to have theater spaces with appropriate ceiling heights. This is one of the theaters that we're inserting into the building. Since our addition allows for roof access, which you can see in this little study model, we made community space on the roof, and we are replacing, in effect, the cornice, which is long gone from this building, the decorative cornice, with a railing that is sort of a lit cornice-like that is also becomes a bench for gatherings up there. And this should be opening in the fall of next year. We're really excited. A few blocks away from this, we built a small residential building on a beautiful street with a lot of character. We had to get landmark approval to build this building, and we made the argument that we were learning from and repeating the rhythms of the buildings of the area. But of course, our fenestration was more 21st century than 19th century. The plan of the ground floor of the building, what you see here is retail-ish space, an entry lobby, and where the X is actually a swimming pool that's on the lower level. This being downtown, they didn't want a doorman, so you come into a very plain lobby, which I'll show you in a minute. But the city of New York does require that swimming pools have lifeguards. So in fact, the concierge, the guy that gets the fresh direct groceries and the dry cleaning, sits back there, and he is also a lifeguard, so he can look over the pool. And the typical apartment, there are north-facing units and south-facing units, which you can see in the other drawing. This is a section, you can see the swimming pool, which has windows to the street. It actually looks like this. The window at the top of the pool area actually is to the street. And this is the non-doorman lobby where you see the ceiling of the swimming pool and follow it down to the, with your eye to the lower level space. This is a typical living room on one of the upper levels. You can see the views to downtown. And this is the north facade. These actually have spectacular views of the Empire State Building looking in the opposite direction. We had some interesting neighbors on this street. This is a Herzog and Deborah building, one building down. It too based on an interpretation of the local buildings. I admired their work enormously, but I have to say, when the both buildings opened, Fortune magazine did a story on Bambi, that was us, versus Goliath, that was them, and in their assessment we won, so that made me very happy. The 21C Museum Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky, which was meant to be a one-off, the people who built it were from Louisville and were philanthropic in their town, has been so successful that they were pursued by other cities to open elsewhere. We've recently opened one in Cincinnati, and as well as one in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is walking distance to the new Crystal Bridges Art Museum. The new building, this was a ground-up building, not a transformation of an old building, and it helps define a sidewalk on a street where there was no street definition before, shall we say. You can see the penguins have returned, this time in a different color. And the idea for this was built extremely inexpensively. This is Walmart country, of course. Was that the very straightforward volume of guest rooms would be pushed away from the street, and a collection of small buildings, little, not quite pavilions, but small buildings with texture would be along the street. And that there would be a sort of lighting strategy that would be much more interesting than what one typically finds in Bentonville, Arkansas. So the ground floor looks like this, and to the lower right is the lobby, in the middle is the restaurant, and at the end is a ballroom and party space. Not all of the hotels are on this model, where the party space is also a museum gallery space. This is a typical guest room bay. You can see how straightforward and you can see how inexpensive it was to build because it's so damn straightforward. The only thing that differentiates the plan is at the back of the building, which is very much a back. The rooms that pop out are that little bit bigger that they need to be to have 2 queen-size beds and then instead of a king. And we studied what, in fact, that would look like on the exterior of the building. This is what we built. This is what you see when you enter, and interestingly enough, this is a region where there is no industry, no tradition of loft buildings, nothing like that. So in effect, we were creating the kind of spaces that we used to find. So this one has clear story at the top and a lot of wall space for art. This is looking from the video gallery back into that lobby space. That odd hanging thing is yet another chandelier by an artist. This is another gallery space as you move toward the back of the building, and in this instance you're looking toward the street. This is going into the cafe and restaurant area, and this is the actual restaurant. You have more appetizing art. It's a theme. And then after you've had too much Arkansas appetizing food, the food's actually delicious here, you can go to the gym. This piece of sculpture is known as Fat Batman. It is inspirational. This is one of the gallery spaces. This, in fact, is a work of sculpture as well, all those flying pieces of paper. It's a permanent installation in that space. And this is the character of that exterior wall. At Bard College, which is in upstate New York, we recently completed a music conservatory for them. We studied its siting because the siting of it was actually quite difficult. It needed to feel like an independent building. There was a building for their music conservatory. but it had to be attached to another building for a host of reasons unique to Bard. So we studied its massing in many ways, kind of built what we studied, which is a happy moment. So the building has a slight curve which allows it to address the street as you drive up the street and gives it an identity all its own. The way they teach music in a conservatory is not dissimilar to if you had your own studio for desk crits, your own little room, and somebody came to you. So each of the small rooms you see in this plan is the room of a music teacher, and the students come to that room and work direct one-on-one with their teacher. This is the path toward the entry, which is within the connecting link to the other building. This is some of the detailing at the brick volume. You could enter the building from both sides, north and south, into the connector. We were lucky to have a great art program here as well. That's a Joel Shapiro sculpture, and actually the drawings on the left are by Robert Wilson. This is the one performance space in the building. It's intentionally a flat-floored space to allow any kind of music and chair layout and activity to go on in it. This is what it looks like when the conservatory orchestra is in it. This is one of the great teaching rooms. This is a second floor lobby that connects to some of the smaller teaching rooms. It was an interesting building because the rooms had to function acoustically in two ways. One was that the acoustics in each small room actually had to be good, but the other was that when you were outside that room, you couldn't hear anything because you were in the next room doing something else. So this is an acoustical study for one of the teaching spaces. These are a couple of those teaching spaces, as is this one. Now, I have gone through these projects pretty quickly, but what's interesting in life, and maybe lucky, is that sometimes you get some quirky clients, like somebody wants to turn a Rolls-Royce repair garage into a fashion photo studio and hangs out with Isabella Rossellini, and a couple of years later, maybe more than a couple of years later, he comes back with a new and crazy idea. This looks very grand here and has noble intentions. It had fallen into somewhat of disrepair. It was derelict, and he bought it. And he came to us asking whether we could turn it into floating video production studios. Why not? That's what I think of when I think of floating children's hospitals. And so we were hired to conceptualize what that actually might be. In this case, it included adding a whole deck so that you could have high ceiling spaces and cutting away floor area among previous decks so you could have high ceilinged spaces. One of the, I think, other than, of course, the exterior of it, which was great fun to think about, getting to do a floor plan where you could label the bathrooms heads was like fantastic. And here it is. Now, we are still getting pricing on this. I don't really know when construction will start, but it certainly was a lot of fun to work on. I started going on and on tonight after Brian's introduction to try to explain my thinking to you. I think lectures are fun vehicles, but they're difficult vehicles for that because architects do a lot of different things simultaneously, but a lecture is inherently linear. And I think you leave out a lot of complexity. You also probably leave out a lot of good stories. I have frozen on this image. Let's see. And that was very nice of them. No, it's, I don't know what happened.
Do you know how to do pantomime?
You mean like pretend I'm a building? You know, it's funny because I tell my students all the time, I want to see it, I don't want you to be it. Did you get it to go to the next one?
Seems to be having a little bit of a hiccup. So you can go. We'll go directly to the next one.
Or we'll go all the way to the end because we've been hitting the advance button so many times. Sorry, guys.
There we go. I think it's just a big file. Throw some notes out.
Back in architecture.
Can I just go to that?
That's perfect. Okay. Because there you can see actually the Marianne Bosque Gallery anonymously sitting on that street. And I think one of the things I was talking about, I know one of the things I was trying to talk about tonight was how we've done a lot, I've shown you a lot of projects. They're different sizes, different shapes, different programs, different locations, but hopefully similar in kind of content and idea. Because I do try to make an architecture that is part of a larger built community of buildings, you know, this kind of, I like the visible, invisible bit. I like an architecture that's implicit, I guess I would call it, containing the nature of something without plainly and obviously expressing it. That's not what the dictionary calls implicit, but that's how I'm using it tonight. But also maybe explicit, no room for doubt, having a sense of humor about your neighbors when necessary. I earlier alluded to sustainability. It's a difficult topic. It's obviously a true necessity, but I think you know from seeing some LEED buildings or Living Building Challenge buildings that not all of them necessarily embody the spirit of what needs to be done, which we all need to embrace. But in all of these projects, you will see reusing old buildings, which is obviously a very intelligent environmental thing to do, embracing natural light, using local materials and craftspeople, allowing communities to kind of grow and prosper around places that they've already built and recognize. All of those are good sustainable ideas that I didn't talk about, but are in the work. And I think architecture needs to change. It needs to bring about change in a world that's changing very rapidly. We talk a lot in school and everywhere else, of course, about how the world has changed since electronic communication has come along, but but buildings don't move. They stay in one place, and this changing world whizzes around them. And I think buildings actually collapse an enormous amount of time and energy and material and effort into one moment, and the efforts of many into a single object, which is something architects often don't talk about. I think the idea of going back to buildings and looking again to see what you discover and finding something new, is sort of like back to basics with some social responsibility and not groaning over community participation, but actually relishing it. I think it's important as architects to take as much pleasure from the workings of buildings as from the image of them, to embrace the design of back of house. We, in my practice anyway, acknowledge the collaborative nature of the whole endeavor. I think being an architect is more like being a playwright than a painter, because you're really dependent on the skills and commitment and participation of others for the successful realization of your work. I don't think of architecture as problem solving, although there are a lot of problems to solve in the process of making a building. Like I said, I do think that being an architect is really about making something you believe in, or something that expresses your beliefs. It is to do many things simultaneously. A lot of them very burdensome, like building codes and zoning codes and ADA and LEED and landmark districts and clients with irrational expectations and conflicting expectations, and my personal bit of revulsion, which is value engineering. But at the end of the day, there is the real joy of making a building. And I will tell you, when you're out there and you're actually doing it, there is nothing more satisfying than walking around the outside of something that you play a role in design. It's really superb. So all of these things, implicit, explicit, visible, invisible, unpredictable but inevitable, which is how I like to think about my work: space, light, form, materials, function, environmental responsibility, community responsibility. It's like a million things that we do, and the poetry part, which is what makes it fun. So there you go.